Are we live? All right, we're live. So, welcome again to our second of my series, of my offering of a weekly class here at the Spiral Gardens Community Food Security Project. With the thing, we've needed to take our education online, and so this is just part of our series of doing that. So far, we've been doing it here on Facebook. You can go back and see Kanchan's video on herbal salve making. You can see my video last week where we talked about the seasons in the Bay Area and what's on time now, what's not on time now, how to work with the seasons. And we went through the tables and we talked a lot about the different varieties. Today, we're going to talk about soil and compost and fertility. And if we have time, we'll talk about pest control. This is a live class. I am actually going to, let me see if I can see you guys right here. Yep, right here. So let me go to that and get the chat up. And right, and every time I got to remember to turn the volume down. And then, yeah, so I can see the comments down there if you put them in. So I'll be keeping an eye on this periodically and answering your questions. So feel free. I'd rather you all were here with us, but we can't do that right now. So this is the best we can do. And the good thing about this is you can watch it later. Just a note, technical note, is we're just getting used to this and we're working on quality. So that will be improving as we go along. The last two classes were not as high resolution as we could, but we're working on solutions for that, and we're also working on better sound and everything like that. So it's functional now, but we're on a big learning curve to make it better as we go. So anyway, yeah, um, hopefully I can see you guys. It says broadcast interrupted. Are we good? Okay, so we're good. So today I want to give some more information, share some more information, answer questions that is going to help you all be more successful in the food gardening and any kind of garden really. But our focus here is growing food for survival and sustainability. And about 5 times more people, at least from our perspective than usual, are doing that right now because the stay-at-home orders and quarantine have given, well, looking at it on the bright side, have given a lot more people to be the opportunity to be at home. And a lot of you all are looking at your yards and really starting to participate in them. There's a lot of you who have been hardcore gardeners for a long time, a lot of our fans, a lot of the participants here, the volunteers, the staff, but then there's a lot of people who are new to it now. And we all have stuff to learn. I've got a ton to learn. I've got some experience, so I'm going to share that. And then as we go along, if you guys either want to ask questions or share tips, please do that. So I'd say we're starting here right now because one of the number one things for success for growing things is a healthy plant. And the big portion of that is the soil. Last week we talked about planting things on time here, or at a time that works for them. That's a big piece too. There's a lot of different pieces, but I'd have to say this competes for that number one slot of of growing things well, growing healthy plants, and growing plants that are able to resist pests and disease. It's never going to be 100%, but there's a saying that a good gardener doesn't grow plants. A good gardener grows soil, and then the soil grows the plants. So I'm standing in front of a soil pile here to really exemplify the point. This is some bulk soil that we get here at Spiral Gardens, and this is some bulk compost here. And we use these ourselves in our plants, and then we also make them available for sale for folks. And there's a big pile of bag stuff behind Khadijah, who is also the one filming this. So thank you, Khadijah, for holding the camera once again while we do this. And we also have Anne hanging out. She's one of our long-term volunteers and board members, and she's got her hands full of plants. Yeah, so there's a few of us here, and yeah, lots of soil. So this is not the only soil you can use. You may be gardening in your yard, actually using the soil, the ground around your house, or you may be growing in containers, and then in that case you're importing some kind of soil, like this, for example, or like this, for example. There's a lot of different possibilities of where you're growing and the kind of soil you're using. So we're going to still try to approach it or give you guys kind of a better idea of how to work with that. So what is soil? Um, this is a mix that we got from a local soil company called Acapulco Rock and Soil. It's one of the main ones around here. There's also American soil, and then beyond that, you got to go up to San Rafael and Santa Rosa, Petaluma to get soil. There's probably some also down the peninsula, and if you're in Contra Costa, there's probably other options there too. But soil in general is a mix of a mineral component and an organic component. The mineral component is basically broken down rocks. Whatever kind of rocks that you may have had in your geography around there. Here we have what's called an alluvial soil, where there's hills up there you can't see from this angle, but it means that water washed the minerals down from those hills to here, and in the process broke those rocks into finer and finer bits. So the finer they are, the more your soil is going to be called silt or clay, and the bigger those little broken down rocks are, you're going to get closer to sand. Above sand, you'd have pebbles and stuff, and that would be a lot harder to grow in. But anywhere from sand to clay is, what's considered, reasonable for growing in. And our soils here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we're located, I can't see your comments here, so because it says broadcast interrupted again, but hopefully that will work itself out. Our soils here are clay, which means
Well, Liza is letting us know that the broadcast quality is pixelated and the feed keeps going in and out.
the feed keeps going in and out.
Maybe this particular spot is too far.
Okay, maybe this is a bad spot. So like I said, we're working out technical difficulties. Um, all right. How many bars do you have on the camera?
Yeah, I can't tell how much.
Okay. Well, we could move some. I don't know if that will help, but let's walk over here and see how it goes. Maybe we'll stand here and see if it's better at all. And I still have broadcast interrupted. It is very pixelated. It's hard enough, man, doing this offline or this online class and then having to deal with these technical things. But we're trying to install some Wi-Fi here in the garden, which is kind of a contradiction of getting that technical stuff in when we're trying to help you get your hands on in the soil. We're going to have to work that out to help get this other information across. So I can see myself moving again on here, so hopefully it's okay. It still looks a little pixelated. Um, I am going to want to come back here to talk about fertilizer. I did want to stand in front of the soil to talk about soil, but maybe let's come this way a little bit more, see if we can get some more bars. When I tested just before we started, everything looked A-okay, so I'm not sure what would be interrupting it now. Why don't we come maybe over here? This is where I tested, and we were doing good at that point. So maybe I'll stand here, and hopefully we'll get some more bars and do this. And Khadijah is actually leaning on a giant pile of potting soil right now in bags. It's another option for soil. So yeah, I'm going to stand here, talk about soil. This looks a little bit better. So we're in the San Francisco Bay Area. Advantages and disadvantages to both of those. Are we good?
Yeah, we just like cut off for a little bit.
Okay. Hey, we're doing it live. We're doing it live. So the hard thing about growing in the soil that we have here is it tends to be very heavy. It's those, I was talking about the size of the rock particles in it, and they're really small. There's not a lot of space in between them. There's not a lot of air in it, and it acts like clay. It is clay. And so you all are familiar with what clay does. It sticks together. If it's dry, it can be really hard. If it's wet, it can be kind of sticky and hard to work with. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad soil. Clay soil is actually really full of nutrients. It's the good things about it is it's really able to hold on to water. It's really able to hold on to nutrients, and you just have to be able to work with it. So when we were standing over there, I was going to talk about compost. Compost is the panacea for clay soil. It's the panacea for any kind of soil. It makes any kind of soil good. And so generally when you're gardening, one of the very first things you can do if you're gardening in the ground is just add some compost. Get a hold of some good compost. The one we have over there, which technology won't allow me to show you right now, is nice and black. It's the other component of soil. So I said soil is one part mineral component. The other part of it is organic. It's things mainly that were once alive and that are now decomposed. And the more they decompose, the more they turn into this kind of black substance called humus. Not hummus, but humus that um, doesn't look anything like the things it came from, be it, a stick, a bug, a dead bird, leaves, whatever it was that died and decomposed. Compost, we all reduce to the same kind of primal substance called humus. And humus is the food for living organisms in the soil. Soil is actually very, very alive. There's in 2 cubic centimeters of soil, there's more living things than there are people on the earth. Before we had almost 8 billion people, I used to be able to say 1 cubic centimeter of soil. Now it's 2 cubic centimeters of soil. That's still pretty amazing that it's that alive. So we're getting ahead of ourselves now. And usually I have a whiteboard for drawing stuff out, for doing this kind of thing when we do a class. But right now I don't even know if our quality, our resolution quality would allow you to see that whiteboard. So we're just going to talk about it. And we're going to be doing this every week. So even though there's a lot of information, there's going to be plenty of time to really kind of go through all this information and really kind of lay it out in a way that everybody can explain. There's going to be lots of time for back and forth questions on this. So if you have a clay soil and you need to amend it, you adding compost to it is a very, very good thing to do. What it's going to do for your clay soil is it's going to take those small particles and kind of stick them together and make them into bigger particles. And that's going to allow passages to form in between. And the compost is also going to help. Well, Evelyn, we're just doing a little online class right now.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's going to help create a better texture to start with. One of the things it's going to do in that clay soil, it's going to make it easier to work that soil later if you need to, and it's going to allow air and water to penetrate into that soil better. But most of all, it's going to encourage life in that soil. It's going to bring in earthworms that are going to help create passages that are going to open up and again help aerate that clay soil. And it's going to bring in a whole ecosystem of microorganisms that do all kinds of jobs in there. But as far as you're concerned, the main thing you're looking at them for is they're going to make nutrients available to your plants. So the nutrients are ultimately coming from that organic half of the soil, the compost, but the plants can't use that directly. They can't, no matter how much, say, compost or manure or whatever it is you're adding to a soil, no matter how much of that you add, if your soil isn't alive, the plants can't use it. They can't directly access that material. They're dependent on the microorganisms to consume that material. And then it's the excretions of those microorganisms that break things down to enough of an elemental form that the smallest roots of the plant are able to use that. So that's super important. And you can think of garden soil as more of a culture than just dirt, right? We talk a lot about treating your dirt like soil, and then treating your soil like a microbial culture, like you're doing a sourdough starter, or you're doing, a yogurt or anything like that, where you are culturing a microorganism, and that's kombucha would be part of it too. All these things that are cultures, that where you're raising microorganisms, and the more compost you add to your soil, the more organic material you get in there, the more beneficial organisms you get too. So what do these microorganisms need besides the raw materials like the compost? There's a lot of other things you can add too, but I'm just keeping it simple to start with. We'll talk in a little bit later in the class about more fertilizers that you can add to soil. But microorganisms need the same things we need, really. They need food, they need water, they need oxygen. So when you have all those things in the soil, you tend to get the healthiest of the microorganisms. Not just that they're healthy, but that they're beneficial to you and the plants. Now, if the opposite conditions are true, like your soil doesn't have enough oxygen, um, generally if it has too much water, then you tend to get bad microorganisms, at least as far as we're concerned, that can rot plant roots and are pathological to the plants. So getting that oxygen in there is really important. And so, yeah, for just talking about soil in the ground still, and specific to the Bay Area, our clay soil, just going to repeat again, if adding compost then gives it more of that organic material component, which helps create a structure of the soil and encourage the microorganisms. And then that helps create a soil structure that has air passages in it. It's not as dense as it was when it was just flattened, pounded clay. And then that allows the air to get in, that allows the water to get in, and then that cultures those microorganisms. Now, if you water too much in a heavy soil like this, it's not the water, it's not too much water that creates bad conditions. It's that there's limited passages in that soil, and if they're all filled with water, that doesn't leave any more room for the air, for the oxygen. So water suffocates the microorganisms rather than the water itself being the bad thing. Now, if you're in a place that has a sandy soil, or if you're using a container that's got a lot of drainage, that may not be as much of a problem because the water can just pass through, and then the air passages open back up again here. But if you're dealing with a heavy soil like that, you gotta water deeply so that the water penetrates into the soil, but then you gotta wait and let the soil breathe some so that the microorganisms aren't, and the insects and the arthropods, and the insects are arthropods, but the worms and everything alive in that soil has a chance to breathe. And we're talking about watering now, but watering and soil kind of go together. It's sort of a general rule of thumb for watering something is when you water deeply, make sure you penetrate deeply, but then wait, let the soil breathe, and letting the first top inch of the soil at least dry before you water again is sort of a good general rule of thumb. It depends on what you're doing. If you've got seeds in that first inch of soil, then no, that doesn't apply. But in general, letting the surface of the soil look dry before you water again for our soils allows that time to breathe. So I haven't seen any comments yet. I don't know if they're not coming through or not. Have you seen any? Okay. So feel free as we go along. This is supposed to be a conversation between you and me, and it's best if they're on topic for what I'm talking about. But as we go along, any kind of question can come in here, and we'll work it out. So that's a little bit about soil in the ground. Now, a lot of folks aren't growing in the ground. A lot of folks are growing in containers. And there you're adding the soil from scratch. And most of those potting soils you're going to add to that are mixed by people. There's a blend that they've mixed in order to create what they think is a good mix for growing in a container. So some of them are going to add some of that mineral component I was talking about. Uh, some of them are going to skip that because it makes the soil very heavy, and they'll make it based on wood instead of mineral. But there's going to be usually some combination of mineral, either pumice or perlite, which is the white stuff we can talk about in there. I was going to bust one of these open over there, but let's just open one here and you guys can see. This is a little bit more visceral than me just talking about it. So this is a commercial potting blend. I like it a lot. There's pros and cons to using this versus that other bulk mix I was showing you. So that bulk mix you saw my handful of earlier, hopefully, if it wasn't too pixelated, that one had lava stone in it, pumice, and it had sand. So that helped give it a lot of drainage. And then that one also probably it definitely has a lot of wood product like ground up fir bark and stuff that isn't fully composed that's using to give it structure. And then it also had a big compost component. It might have some other fertilizers mixed in to blend it. Now this one is a bit different. That soil is pretty heavy because it has all those minerals in it. This is a much lighter soil. They're using this white stuff as the mineral component, as an aggregate to create structure and drainage. But there's not a whole lot of it in here. And perlite, plants tend to like perlite, but it's not necessarily the best material. It has a fairly high carbon footprint. It's actually a mineral that's made into sort of a popcorn. It's an expanded glass. Even though it's not glass, it's not sharp to us. I don't know what the starting mineral is, I should know, but they put it in a kiln and then it expands it and adds a lot of air to it. And so it's very light. It doesn't weigh a whole lot. It's a little distasteful to the eye because it looks a little bit like styrofoam and it tends to float to the top of the pot. But it's not styrofoam. But it's what you're going to find as the aggregate in most potting mixes because it's light and people don't like lifting really heavy bags of things for the most part. So, but the reason I like this soil beyond the perlite is that it's pretty black. It's mostly decomposed. So they actually took the time to get it to something that's very close to humus, if not quite there yet. Now this is a Pacific Northwest soil blend. It's coming from Oregon. So this was based on the mostly fir bark up there and the byproducts of the timber industry. And they make big piles of that stuff and they gave it enough time to fully decompose. Decomposed wood is actually really a good soil and has these things called lignins in them that plants really like. And it's a long decomposition, but once it gets there, it really can support a plant. There's other nutrients that need to be in there. But yeah, so we have this available for folks who are doing containers and don't want a really heavy mix. This is better indoors than that other bulk mix I showed you. But it's just two examples of kind of the whole spectrum of soils that people have mixed that you can use. My favorite actually is mixing the two together, and then you kind of get the best of both worlds. You sort of lighten that one up a bit, but you get the mineral component in this one. The mineral component has a lot of stuff that actually some people feel would be really missing if plants don't have that, some amount of sand, some amount of rock. I'm getting into a lot of detail, and you don't necessarily need to know all these details, but the whole point of this is kind of thinking about the soil that your plants are in and kind of what's appropriate for each of the plants or your conditions. So yeah, this conversation is about putting soil in containers and what you can do with that. And then the previous conversation was about if you're going to actually grow in the ground and how to make that ground better for the plants. Now, which should you do? It really depends on what you have access to. If you have access to ground, I would recommend you certainly use it because to give plants as much room to grow, at least for their roots to grow as there is in the ground, is not something you can really replicate in a container. And plants will have a lot more access to a lot more nutrients that way, a lot more root space. They won't be as bound. But there are very good reasons to grow in a container. One would be that you don't have ground. You don't have access to a backyard. You're in an apartment. You just have a little patio, or you just have a little roof space, or you just have a little space, next to the sidewalk in front of the front entrance to the place, or, a concrete a backyard where someone's poured concrete. All of those situations you can make do by starting plants in a pot in soil. How big of a pot should you get? Probably as big of a pot as you can manage. Usually starting a container garden is a pretty big initial investment. You can be creative. You can find things that will hold soil that you don't necessarily have to pay a lot of money for, or you can just go invest in some pots. And then the next step, which is the trickiest part, is just figuring out what soil to put in those containers. So you could go for a light mix like this. You could go for a heavier mix like I showed you. You could mix them together. And as you go along, you can kind of play with that and see what works best for you in your situation. It will vary a little depending on the plant. Some plants like more drainage, some like more moisture. So this would probably have a little less drainage than that would. And so this is also just easier to move around. Um, so let me see. I haven't looked at this for a while. Let me see if anybody has asked any questions. Not yet. Um, but yeah, getting them set up. Now, once you have soil in containers or soil in the ground, unless in a situation where there's actually something toxic that's added to a soil, like lead from lead paint, and that kind of lead in soil is a whole other conversation that we can have at some point. But in general, soil does not go bad. In fact, soil generally only gets better. It can get used up. It can get neglected. It can, not have what it needs for a long time because people didn't take care of it, or the nutrients in it got used up because a lot of plants were grown in it and nothing was added to it. But you don't need to get rid of your old soil. You can improve it. And improving container soil is the same thing as improving soil in the ground. You can just add some compost to it. Now, how much compost do you add? If I was doing a new plot in the ground, I'd probably get enough compost to at least put 2 inches on top, and then I'd mix that in. And we're not set up today to do a full demonstration of this. We'll get to that where we're doing the class over in the farm. But I usually recommend, instead of a shovel for that, using a digging fork, because you have all that life in the soil, and going into the soil with a shovel is more like cutting into it with a knife. If shovel is what you have, don't feel bad. Things in the soil will recover, but I find a digging fork, a good stout digging fork, which I should have brought an example out of here, but we'll do that next time, is better, I think, for getting into the soil, doing some mixing, doing some aeration, but having less of a cutting effect. So you're cleaving less worms in half, basically, to put it frankly. And they're your friends. You want them in there. Now, if I was adding compost to a container, you can't necessarily add as much as you would to the ground. But add what the container can hold. If there's too much soil in the container, maybe take an inch or two off the top and then replace that with compost and mix that in. With compost, you don't necessarily have to blend all the way down. If you're working with a really hard clay soil and it's your first time, maybe that's good to start with. But in general, if you even just mix it into the top a little bit, that the natural processes of the soil will kind of work that compost down in there. And that's how soil is structured in nature, is it tends to be more humus, more organic material on the top, because that's how it gets there. Things fall onto the soil and then they naturally kind of decompose and are worked into the soil by the action of animals, by the action of worms, by beetles, by ants. Things, this life is part of the ecology, and they're part of working that organic material down in there. Now, in your situation, you're kind of speeding up time, and you're taking a digging tool and you're mixing it in. You're bringing it in from somewhere where someone's already broken it down, and you're mixing that in, and you've skipped quite a few number of years that natural soil would take to do that. So hopefully that's some basics on how to get started, but number one would just be knowing the timing. Well, actually, number one would be soil, I think, and really getting your soil ready, whether it's in the ground, whether it's in a container. Next is then figuring out what plants to plant. So I guess we kind of went out of order of that because we talked about what plants to plant last week. But you can go back and click on that video and watch that whenever you have a chance if you want to go into that. So we've talked some about soil structure. We've talked some about container gardening versus in the ground gardening. And that was just barely scratching the surface on those things. The next thing I'd like to talk about is fertility, which is a little different than soil structure. They're related. But if we can go over there and still have bars on the phone, let's see if we can pull this off. When we were over there before, for some reason, it's only 15 feet away, but for some reason, the picture was not doing as well down here. But I put some fertilizers out. They're a specific brand. Excuse me. They're a specific brand of fertilizer called Down to Earth, but my point is not to necessarily push these things. This is the one we sell. This is a really nice family-based company up in Oregon called Down to Earth, and they've got great graphics, which are really good for videos. These are the ones we carry here. So if you come here, these are what we have. But this, again, is not intended to be product placement for this company, but just to talk about fertilizer and the different blends. So what is fertilizer? Fertilizer is certain nutrients that plants really need. It's kind of equivalent to humans and vitamins. They don't need a lot of them per se. Some need more than others, but they need to be there in certain amounts for plants to be able to grow. And most of these, if you have a really good source of compost, most of these would be in the compost. We can't always get as good of compost as we'd like. The stuff like you make from your kitchen scraps that were made from the actual vegetables that you're trying to grow would definitely be richer and have more stuff. When you're buying a commercially made compost, that's usually made more from yard waste and bulk materials that may have enough in the long run, but may not be rich enough for some of the plants we're growing. So this is just mixtures of materials in a box that are granulated and ground up that have a lot of those nutrients. You could also do this in other ways, like one way a lot of people do it is manures can be really great in soils. Here in the city, manures are a little harder to come by. Some people raise chickens, some people have rabbits, some people go in the hills and shovel from the horse stables. But it's easier if you're like up in Petaluma and there's more ranching going on. Here, those are more premium materials and harder to come by. So this is an easy way for us here to make sure that our compost has enough minerals. So there's numbers on these boxes, which is mainly why I put them out here. Let's see if I can get some sun on this. So, and let me put this up so if somebody comments, I can see it. Yeah, let's get some sun on it. So you see this one is 462. What these are is these are the percentages of the first three nutrients that plants need the most. Plants need a lot more nutrients than these numbers. It would keep going on if they added them all, but this is sort of to simplify it for gardeners. So the first one stands for probably one of the most important nutrients for plants. This stands for nitrogen. Nitrogen, and this means that there's 4% nitrogen in this box. Of this, what is this, 5 pounds? 4% of that 5 pounds, if anybody wants to do that math, is actual usable nitrogen for the plants. Where does nitrogen come from? Nitrogen comes from the air, actually. The air is 70% nitrogen. We think in terms of what matters to us, the oxygen that we take in and the carbon dioxide that we take out, but that's less than 30% of the air. And the bulk of the air is gaseous nitrogen, which is just neutral to us. It doesn't do anything. And the plants can't use that either. There's certain ways that that nitrogen can get into a water-soluble form that the plants can use. And we could have a whole conversation about that. We would talk about peas. We talk about the bacteria and their roots that they make a deal with. But that's a whole other conversation. And we're only going for an hour right now. And it also comes from lightning and rain. Um, but nitrogen is responsible for leafy growth. And so for plants to grow fast and green, that's the number one thing they need. So this is an all-purpose mix. So it's not too heavy on the nitrogen. The next number here is phosphorus, and the next number here is potassium. So this is supposed to be sort of a balanced blend for growing anything from a leafy plant to a fruiting plant. Fruiting plants like tomatoes, this use a lot of this middle number, and that's phosphorus. Phosphorus is involved in different molecular cellular mechanisms for fruiting, and before that, flowering, because all fruits come from flowers. So if you're growing anything fruiting, you're worried about this middle number. And then the last number here is potassium. Potassium is involved in a lot of things with stem growth and cell regulation. And so you can't say, oh, that's just leafy growth or fruit growth, but it is very vital to the plant's overall health. So how do they come up with these four numbers here? Well, in this box, there's a mixture of fishbone meal, blood meal, feather meal. And so those first three are really good sources of nitrogen. And the next one, alfalfa meal. The fishbone meal also has phosphorus and calcium. And then it's got rock phosphate, which is a mineral that they actually mine that has a lot of phosphorus. And then langbeinite is another mineral that has a lot of potassium. And then there's kelp meal in here too. So this is considered organic. It basically, even though like the rock phosphate and the langbeinite were mined, this is a mixture of things that were not created in a chemical lab. They all come from nature and were unmodified, and they were harvested and added to this. And you may agree or disagree with any of those ingredients. That's one of the reasons why we have so many mixes. But it's something to note that in our organic gardening, even when you are just gardening organically, you still are having an impact in the world. There's no such thing as like guilt-free gardening. Even if you're organic, even if you're vegan, you are still having an impact on the flow of materials. And every time you do that, there's some things that are going to suffer. There are some resources that are moved from one place to another, and it's all things to take into account. And so, as an interactive part of this ecology, you just got to do the best you can and figure out how to have the least negative impact and the most positive impact. The positive impact of this is that it will grow really healthy vegetables that you can eat and be really healthy, and it has a less negative impact than doing this chemically could be. And that's a whole other discussion we could have. Maybe we'll have one class on organic versus chemical gardening one day and talk about the pros and cons of those. So right now, this is the number one fertilizer that I recommend, because we talked last week that winter vegetables are mostly leafy vegetables right now. Most of the fruiting vegetables, there's vegetables that we call fruits like cucumbers, peppers, tomatoes, and so on. Those are hot season vegetables. And the cool season vegetables tend to be things that we eat more for the leaf or the stem. Sometimes the flower buds, but not the fruit from those. And also roots. A lot of them are root based as well. So fast leafy growth is really important. We talked about this first number is nitrogen. Nitrogen is responsible for fast leafy growth. So this has the highest first number of the products we have. And you can see the package is green. It's got a broccoli on it, so it's kind of a clue of what it's good for. Now it also has a really high middle number there too, so it's giving you a good amount of phosphorus and a good amount of nitrogen. You can see both of the numbers are higher than the ones on this, so you're getting more nutrient per your dollar because these both cost the same. But you wouldn't necessarily want to add this when you're growing a tomato, because if you give a tomato too much nitrogen, you're going to get this big, monstrous tomato that's big and green, but life is too good for it to decide that it needs to make, a tomato anytime soon. So you got to kind of balance it. You don't want to over fertilize some things, especially fruiting things. Now, over fertilizing your kale or your collards would be less of a bad thing, and you just get bigger kale and bigger collards, and it's harder to over. Oh, yeah, good example right here. This is a tree collard, and it's big and beautiful. And the more nitrogen it has, the more leaves it can have, which is the more you can eat from it, which is great. There is a downside to over fertilizing a green too, is if it grows too fast, it's going to be more vulnerable to pests. And if we have enough time today, I don't know, what time is it? Actually, we may have to save pests for next time, I think, because we're already 40 minutes into it. And we had a few stalls in the beginning because of technical difficulties. But I think we'll keep it to soil and fertilizer today. And then next time we'll talk about pest control. But just know that over fertilizing your plants can make them weak sometimes, and that can lead to pests. Not enough fertilizer can do the same thing. And it seems like high pressure, like, oh God, I got to get it right. But it's really not that bad. It's kind of like cooking, where, you're like, okay, I think you just throw a little bit more of this in, and you can test your soil. You can send it to a lab, and they'll tell you exactly what your nutrients are. And if you want to do it scientifically, you can do it that way. Most of us that would, be a little too much information, probably. As long as you do these things sort of in proportion, none of them are really that bad. Um, so next, I'll just talk about a few more of these things. So this one here, this is a vegan mix. So if you're vegan and you don't want to use fertilizers that have animal products in them, then this is a choice of something that doesn't have any animal products. This has soybean meal, neem seed meal, alfalfa meal, rock phosphite, langbeinite, green sand, and kelp meal. So none of those are animals. They're, you still are extracting things from somewhere. You still are having an impact. The field for those soybeans had to be plowed, and in order to get those soybeans to you, and there was nutrients put into that, and so on. But this is an option for you if you didn't like some of the other ingredients in there. Nature is not vegan, so anything that falls and dies on the soil in nature will go into that soil and be used by the thing. But if you, as a human being, you want to make your choices about what you add to your soil, there are vegan options that you can do. So what else can we talk about? This one is interesting. This one's called BioLive, and a lot of these have bio in front of the name. Don't worry about that. But the idea of this one is it's giving you both those nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And we haven't even talked about all the ones after that yet. We'll do a little bit of that before we're done. But it also gives you a lot of the soil critters that would go in there. It's got, oh man, a whole bunch of big words back here of the endomycorrhizal fungi, the ectomycorrhizal fungi, trichoderma, which I think is a type of bacteria. No, it's another type of fungus, I believe. I'm actually ashamed to admit, I don't know which. I believe that's a fungus. And so the first three I just named are funguses. Now you may be like, fungus in the soil, is that bad? No, fungus is actually a really important part of soil. A lot of times people will turn soil and they'll find like sort of a white mesh in there. And they're like, oh my God, my soil's moldy. Is that bad? It's actually not. There's a lot of funguses that are absolutely essential in soil and not harmful to you at all. And they're part of the whole ecosystem and cycle of decomposition. And without those funguses in the soil, the microbes that I'm talking about couldn't eat those nutrients. So I talked about how the plants are dependent on the microbes in order to eat the raw materials and excrete them so that the plants can use them. Well, those microbes are dependent on fungus and bacteria. Well, some of them are bacteria, but they're dependent on the fungus in this case to break those things down, to sort of pre-chew some of these things so that then they're able to ingest them. So they're all kind of reliant on each other. And in here, it's got, oh my God, I don't even know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, oh, at least 17 kinds of fungus and maybe 18. There's a Saccharomyces, and then there's bacteria, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kinds of bacteria that it's adding to the soil that all have names like Bacillus coagulans or Bacillus licheniformis. Usually they all start with Bacillus, but not always. Some are Azotobacter or Pseudomonas. You don't need to know all those names. You may not even need to add this because most of these are available just ambiently in soil. It's amazing. Like your soil may look dead to you when you start, but you add some compost, you water it, you get some air, some nutrients in there, it will come alive. There is hardly any such thing as a sterile soil anywhere. These things are amazing. They can be dormant for a very long time and be able to then spring to life and inhabit your soil. There's actually, it's not considered preposterous in science nowadays. In fact, it's considered pretty likely that a lot of these creatures have actually spread through space on asteroids because they're so good at surviving harsh conditions that a lot of them could actually survive inside of an asteroid and be viable if it landed somewhere. It's called panspermia, the name of that. I don't know whether I believe it or not. I think it's a really cool idea, but it's mainly, I mentioned it to illustrate how tough these things are. But if you're starting a container with a man-made mix of stuff, you can use this fertilizer and you make sure that you have a really good blend of microorganisms in there. Or if you feel like your soil's been dead for a while and you want to make sure it has those, it doesn't hurt to inoculate. And there's other ways to inoculate too. When we first started Spiral Gardens, we listened to this guy who talked about forest soils and how great they are. So we'd go to different cool forests and just get a little handful of soil and add it to our soil to inoculate it with those things. So Spiral Gardens has been going for 27 years now, and I feel like this space and the gardens that have contributed is sort of a culture in itself, and not just like a people culture, but a microbial culture where we've been adding to it from all different sources. So who knows what amount of fungus and bacteria and microbial life that we have here. Um, got some little bit of time left, so we'll talk about this one. This is Dolomite Lime. This is just a simple mineral. Now this mineral is a good segue to talk about two other nutrients that plants need that aren't in these three numbers here. And one of them is calcium. Calcium's sort of the hidden fourth macronutrient, which I would think I would like to add as a fourth number, but I guess it's already confusing enough to people to have the three numbers on there. So this doesn't even get numbers because it doesn't have nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, but it has calcium and it has magnesium. And both of those are really important for plants. There's a lot of, I don't know exactly how they're used by plants, but there's a lot of cellular pathways that calcium and magnesium are very important to. Magnesium is actually found in Epsom salts, and some people think this guy came in and says, "My wife's crazy. She put Epsom salts in the garden," and she's not crazy. That was actually a really good thing to do. Epsom salts are not the same thing as table salts. Table salts is sodium chloride, and Epsom salts are like magnesium sulfate, I think. And magnesium and sulfur actually, in moderation, are both really good in the garden. You shouldn't go open bags of Epsom salts into your garden, but a little bit actually doesn't hurt. And so both of those, the calcium, magnesium, are really important nutrients for plants. But primarily what this is used is also changes something that is also important in soil, which we haven't talked about yet, which is pH. pH is whether your soil is alkaline or acidic, right? And that's, if you may use it in your current life, or you may hopefully remember it from like high school chemistry, but basically, acid things are things like vinegar or hydrochloric acid, um, where they can be a little burning. They can be a little burning on both ends too, because like lye is an example of the opposite of something that's very basic, something that's very alkaline. And soil wants to be right about in the middle. So there's a number scale that's associated to it that goes from like 1 to 14. 1 is super acid and 14 is super alkaline. And right in the middle, the number 7 is neutral. And that's not acid or alkaline. And plants, will differ depending on the plant, but in general, for vegetables, they just want to be a little bit acidic and over on like 6.5, 6.0, and that's their preferred pH to be at. And it's a hard thing as a new gardener to think about. There's a lot, certain level you don't really need to worry about it. There's simple dropper tests you can get at nurseries to do it, or those tests where you can take a sample of your soil and send them off. Um, you can also get a pH reading that way. I actually have a fancy electronic pH meter here. So if you got soil and you want to know what the pH is, you can bring it to us and we can actually stick our meter in and test it for you. Um, Compost, again, is the panacea for this because compost tends to buffer soils at a pH that's ideal at 6.5. It's funny how nature's set up to work, right? So if you add a good amount of compost to your soil, you've kind of alleviated some of the concern about knowing what your pH is. This is if your soil is way too acid. Sometimes fertilizers, actually adding too much fertilizers, they tend to be acidic and it can make your soil too acid, or there's other things. This will make your soil more towards the alkaline side, and it's easier to use than some other kind of limes. The vernacular way of saying it is sweetening your soil, where but that's just a word meaning making your soil a little bit more alkaline. There's directions on the back to add it, but if you need to regulate your pH a little bit, this is good for it. But yeah, it was also a good opportunity to talk about calcium and magnesium. And then sometimes you need to go the other way. You need to make your soil more acid, and that is primarily if you're an ornamental gardener, you'd be doing this for like azaleas and rhododendrons and camellias. They're your classic gardening plants that like acidity. For us, the main one we think about is blueberries. Blueberries, strawberries to a certain extent, some caneberries. A lot of berries, want to be more towards acid, but blueberries are the main example that we need to actually make sure that something is acidic enough. Because I talked about the scale. Blueberries usually want to be more towards 5, which is actually pretty acidic. Now, you can use this stuff, which is doing it from a combination of cottonseed meal, fishbone meal, langbonite, rock phosphite, and kelp meal. So it's also giving it some nutrients as well. See the little 4-3-6, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Or you could do it with coffee grounds. That's if you don't want to buy this box of fertilizer. And hopefully, if there was comments, I'd be able to see them. Nope, nobody's had any questions so far.
There are some questions that have come through.
Oh, yeah.
Darini asked, how do you add compost to existing plants? Do you fork it in, and how close to it?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I haven't been seeing those comments at all here. We'll get this down as we go along. But if you have existing plants and you need to add compost, you can usually work that in on the top. Now, you don't want to disrupt the roots of the plant too much, and you don't want to cover up the stem. So you can add, a good inch soil around the top of the soil around the plant. More if you can get it in there, but just don't pile it up around the stem of the plant so that it will rot the stem. And if there aren't too many roots near the surface, you can cultivate it in a little bit. Obviously, if there's a plant in there, you can't just mix it like that, but you can put it on the top as sort of a mulch. And then as you water that compost in, the nutrients will kind of work its way into the soil. That's actually the very easiest way to make what's called a compost tea. A lot of people get kind of exotic and they'll take a tea bag of compost, but it's like this big, and they'll mix it with water and they'll aerate it and stir it and stuff, and they'll water the plants with that water to give it some nutrients, but mostly the microbial inoculation from the compost. But if you just put the compost on or in the soil and water it, those plants are getting that compost tea directly the way that they've always historically gotten it. So, not that the other is bad, but that's just an easy way to get that. Were there any other questions?
Eliza asked, where does the compost you sell at Spiral come from?
This compost came from Acapulco Rock and Soil. It's hard for us to, in the city, you kind of just have to get the best that you can. And so we have a limited number of soil companies that we can get it from. This is certified organic. It is similar to the city compost in that a good proportion of it is from municipal yard waste. And it does have some other components in it, maybe some manures and some fir bark and stuff mixed in and then all decomposed together. So it is certified organic. There are some people still who would question, you know, the ability of trace things to come through that channel or not. It's the best that we have available in bulk. We obviously don't have the space or the facilities or the heavy equipment to make the amount of compost here ourselves that we send out the door. Um, they have like 3 flavors of compost that we alternate through from Acapulco Rock and Soil. This one's called Z Compost, which is more the yard-based one, yard waste-based one. They have a grape compost, which is from the pressings of the California wine industry, and it's mainly decomposed grapes and grape pressings. I got that the last few times here because I thought, well, that's cool. That's a neat local byproduct, especially since so much of the agricultural land around us in Sonoma and so forth is being used for grapes. But it has a really acrid smell that lasts about a week every time it's dumped here. So it adds a real ambiance to the place that you didn't think grapes would add. And then they have one they call Deluxe Compost, which is more of a manure-based one. And I like that one actually because it resembles more of kind of the compost that I am used to using, where you have some plant material and then some animal, some poop in there mixed up. They didn't have that one available this time. Ironically, the deluxe compost is not certified organic because they can't backtrace everything that's in the poop from the animals, and it's more difficult for them to certify it. The Z compost, which I would actually think would be a little bit more suspect because of using the the municipal compost is certified organic. So all it goes to show you, I'm telling you all the different lurid details because it's always sort of a juggling thing of like, what can I use? What do I feel good about using? And what do I have available to me? Clearly, ideally, you'd start your own compost pile or your own worm box. A lot of people don't have the space for that, or can't generate the amount of material that they would need to do their whole yard. When I was younger and more crazy about this stuff, I'm still crazy about it, but maybe a little bit more physically subdued than I was. I would actually go and try to import materials for my compost pile. If someone was raking their leaves, I'd be like, oh, can I have those? Or, I'd source ingredients at different restaurants and stuff and bring them all back. It's a little harder for me to do that where I'm at now, but that's kind of what it would take, in a society that is more structured around sustainability, instead of the economic incentive of just sending stuff to the landfill. that basically everything that is sent into the city would be then recycled, and there would actually be a loop of nutrients from the city, including our own manure, is a really important source of waste. I mean, humans eat so well, all those nutrients, and then are just flushed. And they are at this point, instead of being sent out to the bay, they are. This is a different conversation, but they are recycled at the sewage plant, but at that point, they're mixed with so many pharmaceuticals and heavy metals and stuff that I would never use that in my vegetable garden at this point. So there's a whole discussion about sourcing the compost and what you use, but you do need to add some organic material to your soil, however you choose to get it. And those are just some of the options that are available here in the city. People in more rural places have more, options to at least like if I live by an organic turkey farm or something, that would be a great person to have a relationship with. But if I was, for doing this, but we don't have that option here.
Irene asked, where do coffee grounds fit in?
Coffee grounds are great. Coffee grounds are a good um, high nitrogen source. They have a lot of other nutrients in them. Too much of them can make a soil very acidic. A small amount of them is good for things like blueberries, for instance. But I see coffee grounds as a good part of a mix of other things if you're composting yourself. I wouldn't add too many directly into my garden. Some layer of them occasionally is not bad. All things in moderation. Worms really love coffee grounds. So decomposing them in the context of your worm bin, where you mix with the other bedding and stuff that's in there, is a great way to get rid of your coffee grounds. And maybe they even speed the worms up a little bit so they work a little faster in that worm bin.
Liza asks, we have rats and raccoons, so I've been hesitant to compost because I don't want to give them more reason to come. Raccoons also eat the worms. Do you have any suggestions?
So yeah, I don't know if you guys heard that question, but Liza asked about rats and raccoons and composting. So in the city, yes, you cannot just make a pile of compostable materials that have any kind of food scraps in them and expect that you won't get rats or raccoons. You will. The rat issue in the city has becoming worse and worse lately. A lot of people come in talking about various rat and raccoon issues. Um, and basically, the only solution to that I know of is actually, and it's hard because it makes composting a lot more difficult, and people need every incentive to compost. Is you have to make a rat-proof compost bin, which usually requires hardware cloth with a quarter-inch mesh. So either you got to use your own DIY carpentry skills, or if you know someone who has those skills, maybe do a little barter with them and get them to make you a compost bin that is completely enclosed and it's got opening top and opening front to do that. Not many people are going to do that nowadays, which is tough. So, people now do have the option of putting the compost in their green bins and then getting it back prepared by the city. But then that has the obvious downsides too. If you're doing a worm box, it's easier to exclude rats from a worm box because it's more of an easily contained system. But even then, you still got to work on it. Like if it's a plastic worm box, they'll chew a hole in it if there's enough good stuff in there. We use old bathtubs from Urban Ore with plywood on top of them. We make sure the drain is open and it's got the overflow hole is our vent for air. They can't chew through that, but not everybody's going to bring like a bathtub and make a plywood lid for it that they weight down and put that in their yard if they have space for it. If it's inside your back porch or something that's covered, you can exclude them that way. But it's tricky. It's just kind of a whole thing between you and the rats and the raccoons to how to compost your food but not have them get it. You could also, if you buried it deeply enough in your yard just directly, you could do it that way. They might figure it out and get in there, dig that hole back up. Um, but I have known people who've had some success doing it that way. It's tricky. You can buy pre-manufactured compost bins. You can buy pre-manufactured worm bins. Some of those are pretty good designs, and they're generally all made to be rat proof, pest proof. But also, most of them are based on plastic, and plastic can be chewed through eventually if there's enough incentive for the rodent to do it. So, you got to have that little dance with them and figure out how you're going to do it. So, no easy solution, I'm sorry. Were there any other questions? Okay. What time are we at now? Let's see the time that way. All right, well, we're 5 minutes after. That was a lot of material already. Thank you very much for those questions. I could keep going on talking about more stuff, but the goal of these is to make them not too long so that they're more digestible and that people can have more of an incentive to click on them afterwards. And the other thing is that we're going to be doing them every week for the foreseeable future. Once it gets rainy, maybe I'll do them Zoom style behind my desk or something like that to make it through the winter. But want to keep this up, and then we'll be getting other teachers and presenters in the mix too, either on this slot or other slots where they're available. But right now we're just kind of just doing it, getting the hang of it, trying to get the technology together. Hopefully you'll see some improvements for next time. We're going to try to get Wi-Fi in there for a better connection. We're going to try with a more professional mic. Both of those take equipment and know-how, which I'm rapidly working on. And we're also going to work on the platform and try to make it not just Facebook, but other platforms as well. But for now, yeah, thank you for joining. Either if you came in for the live thing or if you are watching this afterwards, please know that every Thursday at 3 o'clock you can count on this happening. And thank you for joining. Please, if you didn't leave comments here or I somehow missed yours, put it in the comments afterwards, and we will be paying attention to those and answering them as we go along. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. It's Daniel Miller, Khadijah filming and watching. We talked a good introduction to soils, compost, microbes, and fertility. And we can continue on more with that next time. But I think my main subject that I think we need to attack next time to help you with your success is when you start gardening, you're going to definitely deal with pests and diseases. Those are normal, nothing wrong with that. So we're going to talk about what to expect and how to deal with them. All right. Thank you very much. This is a wrap. See you next time.